Hello, my name is Philip Plotch, and I'm the principal researcher here at the Eno Center for Transportation. Welcome to the latest in our series of webinars. Eno is an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit think tank that shapes public debate on multimodal transportation issues. Today, we're going to be talking about how we can solve the transit fiscal cliff problem. In the past 2.5 years, federal COVID relief funds have allowed transit agencies to keep operating services, even as ridership plummeted. But those federal dollars are running out, and many transit agencies are facing huge deficits because they have fewer riders and higher costs. Today, I'm delighted to have 4 very special guests who will share their experiences trying to solve this problem and improve transit services at the same time. We have Danny Pearlstein from the Riders Alliance in New York, Amy Ryell from the Chicago Active Transportation Alliance, Eli Lippman from Move LA, and
Hello.
Sam Rockwell from Move Minnesota. They all come from social justice backgrounds, and they're all leading transit advocacy organizations that have had phenomenal success. All 4, I can tell you, are strategic, creative, and tenacious. Whenever you want, you can enter questions in the Q&A box on the side of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as possible after our guests introduce themselves. You should know that Eno is very happy to offer our webinars free of charge. If you're interested in supporting our work, check out the link in the chat box to donate or become a member. And with that, let's start with Danny, and then we'll move on to Amy.
Great. Phil, thank you so much. And great to be here with everybody, with Eli, Amy, and Sam. My name is Danny Pearlstein. I'm the Policy and Communications Director at the Riders Alliance in New York City. We've been around for a little more than a decade. And shortly after we got going, I joined the Riders Alliance as a grassroots member, a subway rider, commuting to work. I happened to be working at the city council then, and I was recruited by a Riders Alliance organizer who came to lobby me for funding for real-time passenger information, or what we lay people call bus stop countdown clocks. And while we weren't able to get the funding that she had asked for, I joined as a member, and I stayed on as a member for a few years. And then when my boss in the council retired from politics, I moved on to the staff of the Riders Alliance. And I've been here since, and we've worked on a number of really exciting things. We stood up Fair Fares, which is now the nation's largest low-income transit fare discount program that affords a half fare to New Yorkers living below the poverty line. And we've worked tenaciously, to say the least, on congestion pricing, which is ultimately the program to charge drivers entering Manhattan south of 60th Street that we anticipate will be online in less than a year, after many years of work and decades of planning and vision by an immense number of allies and colleagues we've worked with across New York and beyond. But then, when the pandemic came, we began to work in earnest on emergency aid. Subway ridership, which had approached 6 million a day, was well below 500,000 a day, April 2020, and has gradually built back and is now, I'm happy to say, above 4 million a day. And I think that the difference is largely owing to folks continuing to work in places like this, where I do, on a part-time basis when I'm not in our office. So the challenge in New York that we faced was enormous. The New York MTA has an $18 billion annual budget. It's one of the largest municipal debtors in the United States. It is, tens of thousands, close to 100,000 employees in various respects, and a multitude of services across the city. And the iconic subway is the first one we think about, but it's certainly not the only one. And the MTA does a great variety of things, including moving, the most bus riders of any place in the country, although unfortunately on the slowest buses. So, we worked on the campaign for federal aid. We developed close relationships with our federal advocates, with at the time Minority Leader, now Majority Leader Chuck Schumer in the Senate, and with Hakeem Jeffries, now the Minority Leader in the House, and the whole New York delegation. But ultimately the MTA, has a huge budget and it burns through money. And so the federal aid is largely gone, as it was intended to be. And the question was, what would happen next? And, unfortunately, roughly a year ago, the MTA was looking into an abyss not too different from the abyss it had looked into 2 years earlier before the CRISA Act, where there were multi-billion-dollar budget shortfalls on the table. And, given the way the MTA spending is structured, a real inability to cut to meet the moment, and cuts that would have, really led rapidly into a death spiral of service cuts and fare hikes, and just the destruction of the service by root and branch that millions of New Yorkers depend on every day. And so, we were able to work closely and successfully with the MTA, with key allies in the legislature that had chosen to make transit their number one issue for the budget that was passed earlier this year throughout last winter, and with our members. So we are a grassroots organization. We have a base of thousands of active members. We have folks who have worked very closely on our issues that we've cultivated into leaders. We have strong allies in elected office, both folks who date back since before they entered elective office, and friends we've made more recently. And we have relationships with partners throughout the city, both transit and planning organizations, and with other grassroots and social justice organizations that typically work on other issues, but understand the importance of transit to their constituents and to the continued well-being of the city and the region. And we worked with all those folks. And what I'm excited to say is we, in some respects, overperformed. We had a really hard budget year. The governor's signature housing proposal went down to defeat. Lots of very, very, very unhappy people left Albany, after the budget in May, and then after the legislative session ended in June. But in transit, we were happy. And we were really encouraged because we won not only a new sustainable funding source to bring in over $1 billion a year to the MTA, but we won, for the first time in decades, an increase in subway service. And we were able to make the argument that transit needed to be better than it was before, when no one could work in a place like this and everyone had to commute to an office on a full-time basis. Transit needed to level up. And so we made a very broad argument for service every 6 minutes in the off-peak on subways and on buses. And we didn't win everything, but we won an unprecedented increase in subway service, so that lines, in some cases, got 50% more off-peak service than they had before. Trains that have been running every 12 minutes are now running, every 8 or 9, but ultimately every 8 minutes, on the schedule. And other trains are actually running every 6 minutes. Trains that are running every 8 minutes are now running every 6. And that is something that we are immensely proud of. And I think it's still rolling out. We're only beginning, to wake up to what that means. And, it's certainly too soon to tell how many more folks it's brought in, but we certainly are achieving ridership records this fall. And we're excited to share that with everyone. And I want to pause here to give everyone else, lots of time. But happy to chat more about that if it's helpful as we move on.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. That's really a remarkable success story. Okay, let's go to Chicago, or actually Springfield in Illinois.
Yes, hi. I am Amy Ryell, Executive Director of the Active Transportation Alliance, and I am literally squatting in a state representative's office in our state capitol right now because we're holding a drop-in session for elected officials on our transit fiscal cliff and what needs to happen. So I'm going to share some of our little swag. We're handing out cookies to motivate them to save transit today. Super fun. So I would say we're a year behind New York and aspire to many of the same things and are doing a lot of similar things, learning from you all. Active Transportation Alliance works on quality of life issues related to how people get around, and transit is just integral to that. We want healthy, sustainable, equitable communities. And when we think about the Chicago region, we can't see that happening without transit. So our fiscal cliff is looming. We know that not addressing it would not only be catastrophic relative to the service cuts that would happen and the jobs lost as a result in transit and outside of transit. We know we have to keep front and center the reality that if our region's transit system is significantly weakened any further, the brunt of the effects are going to be felt by the groups least able to afford it. Seniors, residents of households that have lower incomes, people who are unable to drive due to disability, residents from communities of color. Our philosophy, very similar to New York, is that while the fiscal cliff is the catalyst for getting people to the table, we cannot simply fill the gap and continue with the system we have today, which is a struggling system that is not meeting many riders' needs and not meeting many employer needs. So without diving into the history books, system is amazing. Like we, through the pandemic, kept things operating at a high level, and we were able to influence essential worker travel to their jobs and things like that. So we've got great bones, a lot of a system, but we are in a crisis of service, of funding, and of other things. People are standing at corners that used to have a bus stop. People on commuter rail can no longer get to that rail station on suburban buses. People are waiting on a platform during peak hours for 15 minutes or more. Tonight, I'll take Amtrak back to the city, and I will undoubtedly have a 35-minute wait on my 24-hour train line to get home, just to get on the train to get home. It is not working. The system we have has many different operating entities in it, and it was structured about 40 years ago under the backdrop of Chicago having our first Black mayor, Harold Washington. We had city council wars erupt, and we had a white state legislature that was led by suburban leaders. And the system we have today was crafted in that moment, rooted in really racialized decision-making, and it has, for the ensuing 4 decades, furthered inequities in a lot of ways. And sort of bad policymaking. You guys may know we have a fare box recovery ratio of 50%. So we have to recover 50% of the operating revenue from fares before accessing state operating money, which is one of the lowest shares in the country. Our state gives us about 17% of the operating money. No fewer than 4 reports have called for governance reform and rethinking our structure, including a lot of amazing work by Eno. And so that's where we find ourselves. Financially unstable, service not meeting needs, and structured in a way that's suboptimal and reinforcing racial inequities. So we're at a moment that is really a rare opportunity to correct both these historical inequities, but also build the system of the future. So where are we now? Legislators and advocates passed legislation a couple of years ago in preparation to address the fiscal cliff that charged our Metropolitan Planning Agency to produce recommendations for our state legislature. This is a beast. This is a really complex set of policymaking. Revenue decisions in Illinois are fraught in the best of times. And this brings in funding distributions, who gets what's, governance, and system vitality. So our Chicago metropolitan area for planning has shepherded a process that's led to something called the Plan of Action for Regional Transit. And I was really, fortunate to be able to lead the work on the system we want. And that was really grounded in what we've been hearing from riders for years on their mobility priorities and what will help both serve current riders much better and employers much better, get people back to transit who have not returned, and draw in some new riders, which all reinforces system vitality and stability. I'm going to read one quote that came out of our last round of listening sessions on priorities of riders. And this is from our campaign organizer, W. Robert Schultz III, who led all those sessions. And he was presenting to our state legislature in a briefing. And he said, "I'm here today because Southside seniors shouldn't have to make 2 transfers and ride 3 buses that are consistently unreliable to get their prescriptions. The current public transportation experience turns trips into an endurance test of snail-like bus speeds and long, frustrating waits to make transfers. So we know the better and more responsive the service is, the more riders it'll attract." So where we're at now is this plan is going to be handed over to the governor and the state legislature. While we've been in this process and waiting, the advocacy community has been mobilizing. So we've been holding joint subject matter hearings of the legislature. We've been doing virtual briefings and, like today, in-person briefings. We have a set of champions that are ready to do this work more comprehensively than just the funding piece. But there's a lot of work ahead. So I'll stop there. I think there's plenty more to talk about. But as you can see, we have some similarities with New York, but a long way to go to achieve the victories that you all have.
So Amy, as you were talking, I was thinking about the former mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, who I think famously said something like, never miss an opportunity when there's a crisis, right? I don't remember the exact wording on it, but it's interesting. The two of you see the crisis and say, we don't want to just revert to what we had before, but we want something better. And you actually see this as an opportunity, as opposed to being scared by what you see. That's really interesting to me. Okay, so let's go with Eli and then Sam.
Rock on. Thank you. Eli Littman. I'm the executive director for Move LA, he, they pronouns. We work at the intersection of affordable housing, public transportation, climate change, and clean air. We're sort of the fifth element that brings it all together. And we are really excited. Thank you, Philip, for inviting us here today. So I'm going to talk about what happened in California, why, and how we're getting out of it with the fiscal cliff. Californians had nearly 1.3 billion trips and traveled almost 8 billion miles using the state's buses, trains, and ferries pre-pandemic. It's actually about 13% of all trips nationally, and only New York beats us. And we have over 200 transit agencies. We have really small rural bus operators and then huge urban systems like San Francisco, San Diego, and LA. And we're investing over $4.5 billion over every year annually, and employ 32,000 workers in our system. But and the system itself, the riders, almost 60% of residents have a household income below 35%. $35,000. So deep cuts to public transit are going to disproportionately impact those most reliant on public transit. Our low-income riders, our non-white residents, our Black, Indigenous, people of color, and residents who just don't own a car at all, which might be surprising for people who've ever been to LA, but there are many, many people who don't own a car. So we really need that high quality transit. In addition, 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions are from the transportation sector, primarily cars. And we're falling dangerously short of our goals on greenhouse gas emissions. So that's why we're really fighting harder for better levels of service. Sorry, just turning off the notifications here. So why are we in this situation? Well, we right now after the pandemic, we've had changing commuting patterns. People are working more virtually. Impacts to our funding streams, dramatic impacts, a huge operator crisis, and then huge operating costs. And in addition, the state has this goal of zero emission transit by 2040, and that's causing huge capital pressures. And there was a study done by the UC Institute for Transportation, and 70% of our operators are expecting serious funding shortfalls when the federal dollars run out. And that's particularly acute in the Bay Area, where they're anticipating deficits of $2.5 to $2.9 billion or more over 5 years, as well as in Southern California, which we're looking at a deficit in 2026 of over $1 billion. So, and that's annually. So what did we do? We helped form this coalition statewide called Survive and Thrive. It was really led by groups called Transform, Seamless Bay Area, and Spur. So shout out to them, as well as tons of advocates throughout California. And we had these key allies in the legislature. And I want to give a shout out. I saw them in the participants. I don't know if they're still on, to Ryell from Senator Wiener's office and Melissa White from Senate Transportation Committee. They played a vital role of being champions within the legislature for public transit, and we couldn't have done it without it. So we fought to restore transit funding in the budget, to avoid the service cuts in our largest systems, as well as availability for service for transit-dependent riders. We generated over 10,000 phone calls and emails to legislatures, dozens of meetings, rallies in the Bay Area and Sacramento, and we won. We got this one-time multi-year bridge funding to avoid service cuts, as well as a new $1 billion appropriations for transit capital for the zero-emission buses that I was talking about. And we're starting to see that on the ground, at least in LA. So LA Metro is going to increase service headways on 2 rail lines in a couple of weeks. And they've actually addressed this operator deficit with better pay. But the Bay Area is really still struggling with a sizable gap in their operating funds over the next 5 years. And really, a lot of riders just aren't coming back as quickly as they have with other systems. In the long term, we have a lot of work to do. So we're looking at how we have a more sustainable business model to fund transit in California. Despite the fact that transit is like central to our climate, air quality, housing, and equity goals, we have not invested at the same levels that other states like Chicago, like Illinois and New York have. And we are still dedicating way too much money to freeways, including freeway expansion. A whistleblower just made national news when they exposed that Caltrans is allegedly using maintenance money to expand freeways. So we can't be doing that. The bright sort of spot that we're looking at right now is part of this package that we won requires our state transportation agency to convene a statewide transit transformation task force by the start of next year. And we've already started to have meetings of like, who's going to be on this? And the idea is to push for more flexibility in using the funding, flexing federal funding. And we're actually working as advocates on a big legislative package. So heads up, all you California legislators on transit this year, including a plan to get the governor to actually announce an executive order on reducing vehicle miles travel and supporting public transit. He's done it on electrification for cars and for trucks, but we really need that dedicated effort on public transportation. So that's a report from California.
Great. Thanks, Eli, for covering the whole state from Southern California. And now we have Sam Rockwell. Sam's camera is having a little bit of an issue, but he's going to be reporting from Minnesota.
Awesome. Thank you, Philip, and super happy to be here. Sam Rockwell, I'm Executive Director of Move Minnesota, and kind of similar to Amy, I am sitting in the basement of our state capitol, where often my camera has worked, but because we just had a meeting about the governance of our transit leadership in the Twin Cities region. So we've got a lot of overlaps with things other folks have talked about here today, and I'll be relatively brief and fill in a couple gaps. So Move Minnesota, where I'm Executive Director, is primarily a transit advocacy organization. We also do some technical assistance for local governments around biking, walking, and transit kind of best practices. And we do both grassroots organizing and kind of policy leadership at the Capitol. So, at a high level, we were in a pretty similar position, I think, to others on the call, kind of leading into COVID. We were facing a fiscal cliff. A few years down the line, that fiscal cliff was looking to be about $80 million a year for the transit system in the Twin Cities metro. And then, of course, COVID hit, and ridership dropped, and service was cut, and labor shortage piled on. And so by the beginning of the 2023 legislative session, which we got out of in May here, we were up to a projected $130 million a year fiscal cliff for the transit system, again, for that kind of core metro area transit system. Ridership had begun to creep back up a little bit since the kind of the bottoming out in COVID, but a really slow process of creeping back up. So this legislative session was a new opportunity. We had an election back in 2022, and the composition of the legislature shifted. And we, for years before 2023, had been pushing for a sales tax, we being Move Minnesota and also a large coalition of allies. And we'd also been working to establish a vehicle miles traveled reduction policy in the state of Minnesota, which we were able to get passed by the state Department of Transportation, actually, and in the governor's policy document at the end of 2022. So we came into 2023 with a new legislature, years of organizing and advocacy around a sales tax to fund transit in the metro area, and a vehicle miles traveled reduction policy at the state level. And that allowed us to really hit the ground running in this legislative session, where we were able to secure over the course of the session a 0.75% sales tax in the metro area to support transit, and that's ongoing funding of about $450 to $500 million a year So that moves the transit agency right out of the deficit, the $130 million deficit, and brings it significantly into the black in order to build out the transit system, support better service, which is down 70% or so right now from 2019 levels, and really be able to think differently. We also, in kind of in line with some of the points others have made, we really took the advantage to think about how the transit system should work differently. We were able to decriminalize fare non-payment. It had been a criminal misdemeanor, and we were able to bring it into parity with parking tickets, so that it was, so now it's a petty misdemeanor, a violation, and not a crime. And that allowed us to then create a transit ambassador program here in the Metro Transit system, so that we could have a kind of a different level and different style of enforcement of a variety of issues on the system. And then when it came to the vehicle miles traveled, we didn't want to just think about how the transit system could be different, but we wanted to really lean into how the transportation system as a whole could and should be different. So as Eli was talking, in California, the challenges with highway expansion, we were able to get a bill through and kind of flip it in and work on it quietly for most of the session that creates a matrix for highway expansion projects and grade separation projects. So primarily interchanges that no highway expansion project or grade separation project can happen on the state highway system unless it is consistent with both the state greenhouse gas reduction targets and the state vehicle miles traveled reduction targets. So that means every single highway expansion proposal or interchange proposal has to go through an assessment of induced demand, has to go through a climate assessment, and if it's not meeting those targets, then it can't move forward. Or you can interlink it with other projects like transit projects so that a full portfolio meets those targets. And so that allows and encourages additional investments into the transit system, into biking and walking systems, and also into thinking.
I have to borrow your language on that one.
We've been working. We've been doing some work with Illinois. We modeled that on Colorado, and we should definitely connect because it's we're working on the implementation on that one right now. We know where we are right now. We've got working groups trying to figure out exactly how to implement that highway bill. We've got some need to create real long-term visioning for the transit system. We have a variety of kind of small plans, but the years of being afraid of a fiscal cliff looming really took a toll on the transit agency's ability to be imaginative and think about a vision, right? They were really thinking about how do we stay afloat year to year and not thinking about, you know what, we need to set an aggressive vision for frequency and for the network and for what we want transit to be. So we're gradually seeing some ridership increases. We're seeing service increases, but I think the biggest part now for us is implementation, getting that vision and moving forward on that.
Great, thanks, Sam. We have a Q&A. Feel free to put your questions in there. The very first question we got was, Eli, what's on your shirt?
So this is a mystery. I got this in the mail. I don't know who the mystery benefactor was, but it's from the Metro store, which I see Devin is also on the call. She helps to run, but it's basically the old streetcar and the old bus from Metro, and then the RTD days, which is sort of before early Metro, and then this is the bus and the rail car from the current system. So it's sort of transit through the ages. I thought it'd be appropriate for this.
Okay, thanks, Eli. So one of the questions somebody asked is about working with state legislators, and some people live in states that are extremely unfriendly to transit. So you can imagine if you're Danny and you're walking into the New York City Council, everybody is familiar with the subway system. Everybody rides the subway from time to time. But some of you guys are talking to people who just are completely unfamiliar and unresponsive. And what kind of tactics do you use to try to persuade people?
We really struggled. I guess I'll jump in. We really struggled in California. Honestly, we did not have a lot of allies going in to this last session, and we still don't have a lot because, frankly, not enough of our legislators take public transit regularly, and we don't have a governor who takes public transit regularly. So we really had a challenge, and we still have a challenge. This money that we got, well, it was a big victory. It's one time. And that our public transit agencies, which should be a public good, are basically going to be required to be fiscally sustainable within 2 or 3 years, which isn't going to happen. So we really struggled. I mean, I think part of the argument has been a business argument. You cannot have a healthy city and a healthy business community if people are waiting 1 hour, as Amy was saying, for a bus or a train. It just doesn't work, and you can't get people to work, and they won't do it. But also really leaning into the equity argument. As I said, transit riders in California are very low income. They're predominantly people of color. And we've been, that's so vital to our economy and ensuring that we service those people and they have a way to get to and from their jobs, their medical appointments, and that their families can be able to get to school. So that's vital.
Yeah.
I'll just add a few more things that have been resonating here. The Chicago region is 75% of our state's economic activity. So we're a huge state. We're, huge geographically. But folks in the southernmost point of our state are benefiting from the Chicago region's economic output. And those Fortune 500 companies that come here are coming here in part because of quality of life and transit, which is what young workers want. So I think there's a benefit to folks who live nowhere near a robust transit system, even though they may not see it in their daily lives. But the other thing is, we will not meet our climate goals without transit. Our GHG emissions from transportation, transportation's our number one driver of it. And it has gotten so much worse since the pandemic, even though our vehicles are a lot cleaner because far more people are driving. And we need to give people other options that are much better for our environment, in addition to much more affordable for people. And so I think we're doing some similar work that Minnesota and Colorado did on modeling some of this to make our case really, really solid. But those have worked. The other thing is that the business leaders want this. And so I think that just helps getting some conversations going that might otherwise be harder for advocates to have.
Okay. And Sam, any thoughts about dealing with legislators who aren't pro-transit?
Yeah, a couple additions. I mean, I think it kind of depends on the political philosophy of the folks you're talking to. We really leaned into the climate argument in this last legislative session. It doesn't matter where you are. We were able to show, as Amy indicated, that we absolutely cannot hit our greenhouse gas reduction targets without aggressive transit investments. And this was a real kind of climate year in the Minnesota State Legislature. We passed a 100% clean energy bill and so on. And so that was a really big deal and a big argument. But also when we're talking to folks for whom climate is not a winning argument, one of the things we think about is what parts of the transit system we're stressing. For fiscally conservative folks, stressing an expansion of our arterial bus rapid transit system has been really important, rather than our $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion train lines which are going in, which raise a lot of ire when it comes to thinking about what different people think is the right kind of investment. The bus rapid transit system build out has been quick, rapid, and seen as a really good ROI. We've seen really good ridership increases on that system, so we've got some good things to point to, and it just kind of resonates with a more kind of fiscally conservative viewpoint.
Okay. I want to ask Danny that same question because if you're a state legislator from the western part of New York, you're probably closer to a Midwestern city than you are to New York City. So,
yeah, and if you're a state legislator from the eastern part of Long Island, you're probably, not coming into the city as much. Your constituents aren't coming into the city as much. You're seeing more people from the city spending more time in eastern Long Island. And so you ask a question which was common around the state, not so much this year, but last year, which is, oh, does anyone still take the subway anymore? And the answer is, yeah, at the time it was about 3 million, now it's about 4 million. Folks have looked a little bit askance at New York and seen what's going on in our political scene. Is we have a massive problem with misrepresentation of what is going on in New York City on a day-to-day basis, right? We have a much lower crime rate, for example, than cities across Texas and Florida and other states. But, to be in this media market and to be in this pressure cooker and to have the kind of grievance and resentment politics that we have with the suburbs and with the other parts of the state, some of the time, people start to think really weird things about what is going on. And so it helps to level set and say, well, actually, respectfully, Senator, there's 4 million people every day on the subway, and, your chances of this or that happening to you are a tiny fraction of the odds of getting hit by lightning in Western New York. So it's helpful to kind of do that.
We had to fight against that as well. There was a series of really devastating kind of articles in the LA Times about fentanyl deaths in the transit system in LA. And we were talking with legislators in Sacramento who were like, well, isn't it super dangerous to be on the subway? And aren't people like dying? And why should we give money to this system? Shouldn't we be giving it to, fentanyl crisis or homelessness, rather than the transit system? And we really had to figure out how to message on that and separate the two and say, like, yes, this is an important thing to address, but we cannot forget the public transportation system. And, these are isolated, and it's changed. I mean, the system of 9 months ago or a year ago, at least in LA, is dramatically different than it is just, yesterday when I took the train, the people riding. And so we're starting to see that shift. And we can't let this sort of short-term challenges that we had coming out of the pandemic derail the long-term necessity of public transportation.
Great. So somebody asked about why some transit agencies are facing a fiscal cliff and others aren't. And I'll just quickly answer that question. A lot has to do with ridership, whether that's returned, and a lot has to do with the revenue sources. So if most of your money is coming from the fare, you're more vulnerable to a downturn in ridership. So I'm wondering if any of you have tried to think about how to make a more diverse source of revenues so that you're less vulnerable to different problems. Does that come up with anybody? Amy, you want to go first?
So I think the approach that we are going to be taking is a diverse set of revenue sources. Right now, our revenue is primarily sales tax funded. In Illinois, our sales tax is only on goods. And since the early 1970s, goods has been a much smaller share of our consumer spending and our economy, and services has skyrocketed. But our state legislature has made the decision repeatedly to not tax services. So if our sales tax is how we fund our system, we get the system we have today, which is financially unstable, really subject to economic ups and downs, and really inequitable financially. So we're looking at some of the sources already discussed today. We don't have a vehicle miles traveled program yet in Illinois. We don't have clear congesting pricing program. We have some tolling, but how do we look at other transportation sources of money that would incentivize transit ridership instead of pull people away from transit? So I think that's a piece of this puzzle. And then looking at other things like our mandated programs, like our fare reduction programs and fee fare programs have been mandated by the state, but aren't being paid for by the state. Paratransit comes right off the top of fares, and it's growing because needs growing so much, but we haven't thought creatively about how to pay for that aside from taking that off the top of fare. So I think we are in the moment where we're going to start getting really creative about it, but we want the sources to be durable and grow over time as transit costs rise, as well as ridership rises.
Anybody else want to answer that about the diversity of revenues?
Yeah, so Move LA really cut our teeth on Measure R and Measure M, which were two local ballot measures that we drafted, we created the coalition for, and then we passed in 2008 and 2016. And that provides a significant source of local revenue because we just honestly we could not rely on the state or federal government for that source of revenue. So 20% of that at least, and there's some money set aside for launching new rail lines because we're also building new rail lines, is set aside to operations. And so that's very, very helpful to have that local source of revenue here. And that's really, really helped us dramatically compared to other systems. And LA is unique. We're getting very close to pre-pandemic levels of ridership. We may be there by the end of this year, early next year. That's kind of what we're really pushing towards. Something else that I mentioned before, and I'll mention again, is this Transit Transformation Task Force that's going to look at everything about how we fund transit in the state, including congestion pricing. And that's going to be vital about how we do that equitably. And then the last thing I really want to push on is we need to create a new base of ridership. And we've been advocates for almost a decade of student transit pass programs where you give students a transit pass to ride, and they will ride. In LA, we've had this pilot program, and shout out to Devin Deming from LA Metro for about 2 years. We've had 25 million rides out of this program and brought 350,000 new students into the system. They become the next generation of paid riders. And agencies really need to think about how they create programs, really marketing programs, to get new riders and a new generation and a new culture around ridership, because those will be the riders of tomorrow who will pay to sustain the system and who love the system and know how to use it. So we're big proponents of that. We had a bill last year or 2 years ago. We're still working to push that through as a statewide program.
Thanks. Let me ask a question to Danny and Sam here. There's been a lot of talk about fare free transit. At the same time, there's this talk about the fiscal cliff. At the same time, people hear, hey, there's so much money from the federal government now. But that's really for capital projects and not for operating, right? So I'm just wondering, how do you take those three things together? Hey, there's a lot of money. Hey, let's have free fares. And hey, there's a fiscal cliff. So Dan, you want to go first on that? And then Sam?
Sure. So as part of the large MTA rescue package that passed in the spring, there is a small pilot for fare-free bus service on 5 lines throughout the city, and I think we'll know a little bit more. We had supported the initial fare-free line, which was a line to connect the subway to LaGuardia Airport, which has been working now for several years, and we're excited about that, and we'll see what else happens with this. We conducted a summer of organizing in the summer of 2022 before we entered this big campaign season, and what we found overwhelmingly was that people wanted more service, and the emphasis there was on more service that, we believe in, we support fair fares, so we have equitable fares, but that the important point is that transit should be affordable and it should be fast, frequent, and reliable, because time is money. I think that people grasp that at every, part of the income scale, that time is money. And really that's what transit should be affording us. And that's what frequency is about. That's what reliability is about. And so we are particularly keen on that.
Yeah, Sam here at Move Minnesota. I think we take a pretty similar approach. We also have a free fare pilot underway right now, 2-year pilot on 2 lines. We support the idea of free fares, but after we accomplish some of the service improvements. I think time is money, and also, we're not in a system like New York where really the backbone of the transportation system is a transit system. I mean, the backbone of the transportation system in the Twin Cities Metro is still very much the car, right? And so if we can make a transit system that allows more people to shift from car ownership, which is extraordinarily expensive, to transit use, I mean, that is a huge, huge, huge financial windfall if you don't have to own a car. And so we really are prioritizing getting that service up. So that's the speed of the lines. We're pushing for better, bus lane edge on our streets and signal priority and our stoplights. We're pushing for, more frequent service, and we're pushing for more comprehensive networks so that more people are within a 5 or 10 minute walk of a line. And if we can get those things done, then I think reducing fares or dropping fares altogether is kind of a really important next step. I will say, kind of dovetailing off of what Eli said a minute ago, we are supportive of a variety of fare programs. There's a renter transit pass There are transit passes to get university students and high school students onto the system, and that's really important to build the ridership back up. So insofar as we can use kind of fare-related incentives to get people back on the system, build that ridership, that is a really important tool.
Okay. So I hate to do this, but we've run out of time. And I wish we had done an hour instead of 45 minutes. So everybody can blame me who's listening. I just want to say thanks to all of you. I was really looking forward to this, and it was actually a wonderful way to learn about what transit advocates are up to, and especially about their successes. And definitely appreciate all of your insight today. Thanks to everybody who asked questions, and sorry we didn't get to all of them. We are going to write an article in the Eno Transportation Weekly on Friday, and we'll try to summarize this and maybe hopefully answer some more questions that people have. You can find a recording of all this webinar and all of our webinars on enotrans.org. And we're also going to email the recording to everybody who registered. And apparently there were over 500 people that are registered for this. Make sure to sign up for our mailing list, and you can gain access to Eno Transportation Weekly, webinar announcements, report releases, and more. And we're very happy to offer these webinars free of charge. If you enjoy them, there's a link in the chat box, and you can learn how to donate or become a member. Thanks again, and have a great day.